Coming up on Why Should I Trust You? It's no secret that media is a major driver of mistrust today. Mistrust of establishment media is hitting record highs, while podcasts, YouTube creators, and social platforms, which make up the so-called new media, are booming in popularity. Is this new media mainly just a vehicle for misinformation? Or is it ultimately a good thing, surfacing opinions and questions that for far too long had no outlet? That phrase, right-wing media ecosystem, is being used a lot these days. Many on the left say it's impossible to compete with it. It's why Trump won. It's why young voters are swinging to the right. And it's why trust in public health and science is cratering. But is that the right way of looking at it? Our guest today is Emily Jashinsky, who is fluent in this new media. She thinks we're missing the plot on why this change in media is resonating with people right now. And she says COVID changed the game. Let's get started. Welcome, everyone. Welcome back.
Yay, welcome.
Hope everyone had a good Passover, a good Easter. Tom, this is a weird episode for us this week. It's just you and me.
Yeah, no Maggie, no Mark. I know their fans are going to be furious, and you'll get all the letters and emails from them.
I know. They get the week off, and I'm happy for them. And I'm really excited about this episode, because so many of our listeners have said, how can we do a show about mistrust and not talk about the media? They're like, hello, that is like, if there's one group that people trust less than government and science, it's the media. So
is the media coming below Congress? I know they were vying in terms of least trusted, least.
I feel like the media is, and again, when we say media, I think what they mean is like establishment media right now. Right. So, but yeah, it's bad. But guys, this is it. This is our maybe first of what? Like, should we do like 23 media episodes? What should we do?
That's the plan.
Okay, we're gonna do like 23 media episodes. Okay. But first of all, I'm really excited about our guest. I want to welcome Emily Jashinsky.
Welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me.
It's really good to have you, Emily. So I just a little bit about you. You formerly worked at the Federalist. You worked at the publication called The Hill. She's currently the co-host of Counterpoints along with Ryan Grimm. And she's the DC correspondent of UnHerd, which is a news and current affairs site, and the host of Undercurrents TV. Did I get all that right, Emily?
I know. Yes, you did. It's so it's so much when you say it. I stress myself out listening to how much work I have to do. But yes,
I'm like, girl, that is a lot. So, Emily, it's really good to have you, and we're going to bring you on in just a second. But Tom and I, as we like to do, we like to kind of lay out where we're at in this conversation, and we should mention that Tom and I both got our start in like old-fashioned news, right, Tom?
Yeah. When did you start at ABC?
I started at ABC in 2003, basically right around the Iraq War.
Oh my gosh, I'm so old.
Okay, Dish, when did you start at ABC?
1994.
Oh my God. So that was Peter Jennings' days, right?
Yeah. ABC was like number one. This was, I think the narrative is that ABC thrived at the end of the Cold War. And as we plowed into the 90s, post OJ, NBC nightly news started to ascend.
That's right.
But yeah, it was a heyday for network television. This was like Seinfeld, Friends, it was like a golden time for the networks.
Yeah, that's right. And I always like to say that even though I'm no longer a part of that world, the one thing that it did teach me was just some really hard skills on how to do some shit. You know what I mean? I learned how to edit. I learned how to do a lot of really good research. I learned how to, what it meant to get a source talking on background versus off the record versus deep background. I learned how to shoot a camera. For me, that was all happened at ABC, and I'm really grateful for that time. But boy, does that seem like ages ago. And, that was then. But Tom, you have recently taken a look at the current state of our media world. Take us through some of that.
Yeah. And this is to Emily, hang with us because I know you know all this. We all know, or at least I think we know, that the media landscape really dramatically changed in the 2000s. And it was driven by the internet, sort of a technological upheaval, and suddenly no longer news and information had to be top-down, authoritative voice, sort of the Walter Cronkite, the Jennings, the Rather, the Brokaw. You suddenly had users able to share content, find their niche, for where they wanted to receive their content. Certainly there's exceptions. The network newscasts still pull in millions of viewers every night. Fox News is thriving. But overall, the trend lines of sort of that legacy media is mostly going down. So we hear a lot from a sector of our audience that this new media landscape is, squarely to blame for the breakdown in trust that we're seeing in public health and science and medicine, especially. They see this as a right-wing dominated media landscape. It's an echo chamber where misinformation is spreading like wildfire. It's boosted by the algorithms, which are primed to spread conflict. In essence, they say there's millions of users who are being brainwashed, and they contend that the left just doesn't have this ecosystem and that they're, working from a tremendous disadvantage. You hear a lot like on the left, like, we need to develop our own Joe Rogan. In this sort of everything is stacked against us, I find it so incredible because as we talked about, coming into news in the 90s and the 2000s, it was such a different perspective. The conservative voice didn't have a home, and thus Rush Limbaugh, thus Fox News. The conservative voice felt everything was stacked against them, that liberal bias was unbreakable, and that they just didn't have any outlets. So that I think is such a huge transformation. Now, Media Matters, which is a liberal media watchdog group, I guess that's a way we could summarize them. Like, knowing its audience, they put together an analysis, and they termed this analysis as a response to our modern day media crisis.
I got so many texts that day of like, have you seen the Media Matters bubble graphic?
Yeah.
So tell our audience what that was, Tom.
Yeah, so it was like a graphic that they made with red and blue bubbles. Red, right-leaning, blue, left-leaning. And each bubble was like a podcast or online show out there. And the bigger the audience that show had, the bigger the bubble. And so the result was this like sea of like really monstrous, big red-leaning bubbles with like a few left-leaning bubbles tucked in there. And as you said, Brinda, this thing took off. It was like confirmation in red, blue bubbles. Like, this is what I've been saying. Their point was more than just Americans are, increasingly getting their news from podcasts or sharing, their opinions on podcasts. They found that of the 320 most popular of these shows today, the overwhelmingly right-leaning ones dominated the ecosystem. And so we're talking across YouTube, Rumble, Twitch, Kick, Spotify, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. Left-leaning shows had a whopping 5 times less followers. And, of course, there are some popular legacy media podcasts like The Daily or left-leaning podcasts like Pod Save America. But like the final dagger, for the liberal heart was that of this analysis was that 9 out of the 10 online shows that were most popular were right-leaning, with a total following of 197 million users. The report's author wrote that the Democrats spent billions last cycle on ads, but paid ads have little and diminishing value. And if they'd spent $100 million on storytellers instead, the election probably would have been the same, but the landscape would look different right now. But the point is, the Democrats didn't, and now this is where we are.
Right. So look, I want to bring Emily in. I want to start off with kind of a bigger picture question, which is, there is this liberal critique that much of this right-wing media ecosystem is actually just misinformation. What's your take on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, Gallup has tracked trust in mass media every year since the early 1970s, and trust in mass media has been on a steady decline actually since the mid-70s. It really declines. There's a very, very steady decline that you can track in Gallup from the mid-70s to the mid-90s. And then things fluctuate a little bit, and you can see the introduction of the internet really as the sort of mass use of the internet around that time period of having a really significant influence on the way people saw media. And it's continued to go down. There have been some spikes. There's fluctuations in the last decade or so, but trust in mass media now, I think Gallup has it in the mid 30s, and that's a drop from the mid 70s in the early 70s. So people used to have a lot of trust in mass media. And I don't think you can just point the finger, given that the decline starts happening in the mid 1970s. I don't think you could just point the finger at sort of the toothless rubes and right-wing media who are slinging disinformation everywhere. You don't have Fox News until the mid 90s. Conservative media in the mid 70s is basically National Review and other things like that. There's all kinds of difficulties with pinning declining trust in media just on disinformation. I think that's actually a really, really hard case to make. The problem, as I see it, is that the media's response to declining trust in mass media has been to sort of double down on its righteousness and say, we actually are the good actors here, which fuels the distrust. That's why this keeps going down, because there's a lack of introspection, which to some extent is natural. When someone tells you you're doing something wrong and you think you're doing something right, your initial human reaction, and this is industry wide, is to defend yourself. But that self-defense has gone on for decades, and it has just pushed people into the arms of new media, which has some really bad actors. I think it has some really good actors who are treated as though they're bad actors because they get lumped in with the legitimate bad actors. But the pattern, as I see it, over the last half a century, is that you just end up that the media has fueled its own demise by defending itself rather than really looking inward. There's no reason that trust in media should be lower now than it was in 2017, when everyone in the press got the shock of a lifetime because the host of Celebrity Apprentice defeated the former Secretary of State in a presidential election. One of the sort of silver linings of that should have been, if anything could rattle the media out of its bubble of sort of self-congratulation or self-assurance, it would be that. And yet trust in mass media has continued to go down. That's not just because of disinformation. That's because the Russia story was wrong. It's because even the New York Times is admitting that some of its COVID coverage was really wrong. Or the Washington Post, I should say, admitted some of its Russiagate coverage was really wrong. That is not just disinformation. That's real because you have even the mass media itself admitting it.
Yeah. I mean, I want to unpack some of that because I think it's so interesting. I think you're spot on to talk about that trend line, going down, kind of crashing down since the 70s in different places. And to one degree, it's sort of inevitable, right? I mean, you talk about the internet just being this kind of great democratizer where suddenly people just have the ability to search for things and the ability to get information. And in some ways, the rise, when blogging was happening and things like that, folks were getting upset at the Huffington Post and was this mistrust somewhat inevitable when you bring the internet kind of into it? That like when you have this great equalizer where folks are just able to get stuff on their own, does it inherently devalue kind of what like Tom and I did? Like, why do you need us as much if you can find the information on your own? I'd love to hear your answer to that.
Well, and I think also what the internet does, yes, I agree with that. I think what also it does is inevitably it puts these tools in the hands of journalists that will inevitably, I think, degrade the quality of the journalism that people do because the algorithms incentivize opinion. The algorithms incentivize speed at a level that is not the same as needing to get your story out for the nightly edition and turn it in by deadline so that you can get that 5 p.m. paper out of the street. Literally, what the algorithms do on social media is instant, and it's incentivizing strong emotion. We know that. That's actually like how these things operate. We are very that's not a secret. So I think when we transferred so much of journalistic activity, including news gathering and news dissemination, onto social media platforms run by algorithms, it was going to not just change the way audiences receive journalism, but it was fundamentally changing the way that we gather and disseminate news as journalists in some really negative ways. There's some really good ways. There's a little bit more transparency. Your journalists are more accessible to the public, even though most people aren't on Twitter. They can, if they wanted to, theoretically, email a journalist, find the email, or find the social media. It's a lot easier than having to send a letter and all of that. And you can have a more, I guess, honest back and forth. So all of that stuff, I mean, there's some good that comes with it, but I think a lot of this was inevitable with technology. And, I joke with my Catholic friends as a Lutheran, I joke with my Catholic friends all the time about the printing press because they'll say, well, listen, Protestantism becomes inevitable with the printing press because you start questioning, authority. The more information is sort of circulated, the more people can read. So this isn't new. I mean, our institutions are going to come under significant threat anytime there's new technologies that accelerate the spread of information. But at the same time, I think it's the responsibility is not just on the news consumer, it's also on us as journalists for, I think, falling into the very human, the traps that sort of exploit our humanity, just as people. They're affecting consumers and journalists alike.
Yeah, and I totally take that point. I think we all fear that we're no longer dealing with the same set of facts anymore, that's becoming now part of this opinion swirl. But do you feel that this sort of new landscape may be addicted somewhat to conspiracy, like especially when we look at, the subject that we wrestle with, which is sort of the breakdown in trust with public health, coming off of COVID, which was just a brutal experience for everybody. We still see COVID conspiracy, just it's rippling still through this kind of right-leaning media ecosystem. The legacy world has kind of moved on. Like they'll do retrospectives and things like that, but this is a hot topic now. Is that an addiction to conspiracy? Is that just it was so profoundly, the people felt so profoundly violated by the public health recommendations, advice, policies, mitigation efforts that they're still processing it? Like what do you see going on here that this is still such a hot topic?
Honestly, I think conspiracies are interesting to humans because they're good stories.
Right.
They're just are incredible narratives usually. And sometimes, there's I think one of the reasons we're seem especially inclined towards conspiracies now is because they give you a sense of agency over the news, that you can be actively putting the pieces together. It's not that every individual who's interested in conspiracies thinks they're going to solve it. It's mostly just that as you are, I think this is I have a theory about true crime and women that this is actually really similar to, where when we lack agency in our lives, we seek out these things because you end up just sort of mentally putting puzzle pieces together while you're watching a docuseries, whether it's on a political conspiracy or Karen Reed or something like that. You're sort of actively engaging in it as a consumer. But so I think some of this is just algorithms are preying on what makes us human. And that is unique to this moment, in that the technology is really the ability of technology to prey on that is next level. I mean, we've never seen anything quite like this. So also, though, I think with the technology, there's so much, like, if this is, again, it's a very niche example, but there were these two FBI agents, Peter Strzok and Lisa Page, which, if you're in right-wing circles, everyone knows Peter Strzok and Lisa Page. A lot of other people don't. But one of the reasons the Russiagate conspiracy started to get legs with the right, who was looking at this and saying, this looks like a conspiracy theory, they were caught texting each other. They had put in writing this idea that there would be an insurance policy against Donald Trump being elected. And the reason I mention that is because part of the reason I think we're also obsessed with conspiracy theories right now is that people in government and in big business and big media, because of social media, because of technology, because of cell phones, we are putting so much of our thoughts in writing. And that those are pieces of evidence that used to be ephemeral. It used to be something that was said. But now we just do so much of our lives in recorded spaces that there's so much more to work with.
And more
so
kindling,
there's this degree of transparency or accessibility to the past that is just completely, I think to some extent, tearing back a curtain. And all of this is like a perfect storm.
Yeah, and I love the true crime analogy. I mean, you can really draw a straight line between COVID and the true crime analogy. These are both instances where, either crime or a pandemic, people have completely lost agency over their lives. And a conspiracy theory sometimes can help you make sense of things that otherwise you just can't figure out. It's something to sort of explain things that are so foreign to you that you can't make sense of why this is occurring.
I want to go back to something you said about Trump, because I worked at CBS News during the first Trump administration, and I'll just speak honestly about what that experience was like, because I think what ended up happening, and I'm seeing it happen now with this administration, is I think Trump is really effective at volume. He puts a lot of shit out there. You know what I mean? And I think what we wrestled with in the newsroom at the time was how to take it all on. There was this we got to fact check everything because there's things that are coming out of his mouth that are straight up not true. And so every night it was like, well, like if we had like a little ding, right? We got to keep pressing the ding to make sure we get him on all of his lies. And I think that is the same moment that science and public health are finding themselves in right now with new media, where there's this deep desire to like ding every lie. And look, the truth is there are a lot of untruths that are said that aren't just kind of like, well, is it just your opinion that the earth is flat or round, right? I know that the Cato Institute did, which is a conservative leaning institute. They did a poll that even their and they did it, I think, with YouGov, that found that like 3/4 of the people who responded were like, no, there really is a line that you could cross to say that to take bleach to treat COVID, or to say the Holocaust didn't happen, or to use racial slurs. Like those are things that the Cato Institute and YouGov's people were like that, like we're not okay with that. And I think Russiagate is a really interesting example, because here you have something. I mean, I am 100% with you that the breathless coverage of that story, where you had countdown clocks, you had this sort of like adulation of Mueller and what he had for lunch and like what he was wearing that day. And like, it was just so fucked up. And once the report came out, I think people were like, what the fuck was this? But then I wrestle with the fact that then a little bit later, there was that bipartisan Senate investigation that found that there was actually like successful attempts by Russia to interfere in our election. And so I think the way the media did it was not okay. And I think it bred mistrust, but it also missed the opportunity to tell the real story, which there was a pretty dangerous attempt by an adversary to impact and influence our elections. So I guess my point would be, Emily, like, are we setting up a false choice in some ways of it's either gotta be misinformation, or it's gotta be this like constant, we have to fact check every single thing coming out of people's mouth. I hope that makes sense what I'm saying.
Yeah, I think the fundamental problem is losing the forest for the trees. And that's, I think a lot of that goes back to the incentives that social media thrusts journalism into, the incentive structure that journalism has been thrust into. But actually, the Russiagate example is a really good one. I actually think the bleach example is a really good one, too. Like, as somebody who was at the Federalist at the time, very conservative. A lot of my colleagues were really, really pro-Trump. And so I was in an environment where I was getting that perspective constantly. With the bleach, it's so interesting because on the one hand, there were some people in the media who ran with a story about what he said that was like a stretch. It wasn't, I wouldn't call it like completely false, but I would say it was a stretch that he was saying like just swallow like your Clorox and COVID is gone. But at the same time, what you had was the president of the United States, like just riffing on potential complicated medical treatments for a brand new pathogen that was very complicated in and of itself in front of the entire country. So you have two things here. One is that the president is doing something genuinely extraordinary. And the other, you have the media, and I use the media like in a conglomerate sense, and I know that we could talk about all of the complications of doing that, but you had an emergent media narrative that was flawed and misrepresented what was, I think, legitimately a problematic statement. And it's very similar with Russia collusion, which is on a much bigger level, in that like there were serious attempts by Putin, as I think it was 2018 Senate report put its finger on. And you did have, Don Jr. agreeing to take a meeting with the woman whose name escapes me at the moment. You had Donald Trump talking to WikiLeaks or Russia saying, hey, if the emails are out there, like all that stuff was going on and it was crazy. But because I think the media lost the forest for the trees and was interpreting every tree as necessarily representative of the forest, you ended up getting a narrative that snowballed. It just ran out of control. And everyone forgot to go back to the very basic predicate of the story, which is, is Donald Trump an asset of the Kremlin? Because this is the narrative. This is why people are tuning into Rachel Maddow's show over and over again. Is because there's this suggestion. Some people outright said it, but there was otherwise the suggestion that Trump was an actual agent, wittingly or unwittingly, of Vladimir Putin. And I think all of these stories about his crazy connections to Lev Parnas and to Rudy, and it's like all of the stuff, like, is it newsworthy? Yes. Is it newsworthy in the context of this big narrative about Donald Trump potentially being an asset of Russia? Probably not. And I think it's just really easy for that stuff to snowball. And the sad thing is it ends up undermining the legitimate news story. And that's, again, why I have a really hard time when people in legacy media today continue pointing their finger at new media, continue blaming Alex Jones, or continue blaming people like, or outlets like the Federalist, where it's like, if the Federalist hadn't been covering Russia collusion from a relatively pro-Trump perspective, actually a lot of this stuff would have taken even longer to come out, if it had come out at all. And it's not to say that everything was right, but it is to say the narrative was wrong and someone had to push back on it. And if the people who are pushing back on it are, quote unquote, fueling mistrust, it's because you guys did something wrong to begin with. And if you just started getting some of these big questions right over and over again, because you are able to check your political biases, you would actually take away the power of new media. And I mean, that's like, by the media's own argument, they could defenestrate new media without censoring or anything like that, just by starting to get some of that stuff right.
Let me push you on that, because I've heard you say that. And again, before I even get into the biases issue, I'd say, again, going back to that kind of conundrum of volume, where you know, you mentioned someone like Alex Jones. And again, when I think of Alex Jones, the first thing I think of is like him saying that Sandy Hook was a hoax, right? Which is like such a painful, awful, vile thing to say that even folks on the right have attacked him for it. And there's been lawsuits and things like that where he's where he's gone bankrupt because he's had to pay for that. It all gets lumped together, right? So the value that new media, and maybe someone like even Jones, but let's put him aside for a second and bring up other people who I think are better faith actors, whether it's Rogan or whether it's Ben Shapiro or folks like that, who I think folks on the left would still say they are peddlers of misinformation. And what I would love for you to help us unpack, because I will honestly tell you now, in my new me, I fully, like, I listen to hours of Rogan, I listen to Ben Shapiro. I want to really hear what they're saying, because I truly think that the world of like these tiny little clips that get shared and headlines shared.
That's
really,
a big part. That like in the left world, what they see is the clip of Rogan with Mel Gibson saying ivermectin cured my friends of cancer. And that's gone viral in the left mainstream world for obvious reasons. And that's all they see. That's all they see of this thing called Joe Rogan. So like, I think and I didn't mean to jump in, Brinda, but just like help our audience understand like the relationship between Rogan and his audience, the length of this podcast, the different ideas that are flying around.
And I'd say that last piece that you said about checking your biases, and I've heard you say this on Megyn Kelly's show, which I thought was really fascinating, where you were like, if only legacy media knew that to be upfront about your biases actually builds trust. And that was like a moment for me, because we've always been taught, like, you never say who you vote for. We had anchors who never voted, and they somehow thought that was like, hey, I'm not going to name them, but they'd be like, I don't vote, which means that no one can, like, you can't get me. So look, that was a big question we just threw at you, but maybe you take it even like, however you want to take it, Emily, however you want to take what we just said, you go.
No, that's super interesting. That I have friends who still like don't vote because, you know, they try not to put their thumb on the scale or be a part of the story that they're covering. And I have this theory that is sort of half a joke, but also completely serious to the extent that's possible, that legacy media could restore public trust overnight by just coming out and saying, like, if the New York Times came out tomorrow and said, our news coverage reflects the editorial bias that you see on our opinion page. Washington Post said that. If any mainstream media outlet said that, I think it would just significantly improve the public's trust in media. I think one thing, especially with Gen Z, when you talk to them, is because of the volume, because we are being flooded. I mean, think about this. You used to have to seek out the news to hear it. So you used to have to either turn on your TV, turn on your radio, or pick up a paper, or be a part of like a local meeting, whatever, to find out what was happening. But now, if you're scrolling social media to catch up with your friends on Instagram, you're also getting the news. You're getting politics, whether you want it or not. The algorithm is delivering it because politics and news is a great way to keep people scrolling. Facebook, wherever. It's not just whether you're seeking out the news, it is coming to you because of social media, no matter where you are. And I think what that's done, it has made it really hard for people to keep track of what's what, to keep track of what's pretending to be neutral, what's actually neutral, to keep track of who's left, who's right. You just want to be able to have that shortcut and be like, I can compare. And I actually think this is a good thing, by the way. I can compare the New York Times that's trying the very best to sort of do the quote unquote both sides thing, but leans left. I can compare that with the Daily Wire. I can compare that with National Review. Like, I'm doing it anyway because it's all attacking me on my social media. Just tell me so I don't have to work overtime to figure out exactly what it is you're trying to do.
Help me understand that, because I subscribe to this service or this newsletter that actually like rates the stories. I think it's called The Grounding or The Ground something.
Ground
and it
news,
says, yeah. And it's really interesting because Tom, if you don't subscribe to this, it's really interesting. It'll like take a story and it'll be like, this is a little bit more right leaning, this more left leaning. But what I'd love to figure out about that is like, why does the viewer, the listener, need to orient themselves politically when they're looking at something? And I genuinely want to just ask that, because like, like there are times where I go onto news where I just want to know the like what happenedness of something, right? That like, okay, he instituted the tariffs. I want to know what happened in the markets that day. I want to know how China responded. I want to know what this person said. Are you suggesting that even in a case like that, it's helpful to know the reporter's biases, because even with just your basic who, what, where, when, why, there's still bias that seeps in?
Yeah, and just to tack on, like I think that's a provocative idea. I also think it's a terrible idea, but that could be my old schoolness. But like, would you even like to jump on what Brinda's saying? You think there's more benefit from a reporter who's, you know, trying to check their biases, being open-minded, following the facts, doing investigations, equal opportunity offender. You think that the viewers today, the users today, still see those reporters as human beings, therefore they are biased. Therefore, just skip ahead and tell us what your bias is, and then let me read your story. And like, you truly think that would be a beneficial thing?
Well, so I think in this media, or I think in this, in this information economy structure, I think it's basically the only way. And I don't think that's necessarily good. I think when we had more monoculture and we had these shared touchdowns, I think it was healthy that, you know, Walter Cronkite knew he had the pressure of these advertisers who wanted Americans left and right to feel confident that they were actually getting the news. I actually think that was a wonderful model. I think that's why trust in media was high until you started to see cable and all these other technologies come in and fill the vacuum.
It was a good pressure. It was a good, yeah.
It was. Yeah, I agree with that. But I think now there's no putting the genie back in the bottle because of social media. There's now influencers who are like doing the news, and I think that sucks and is insane. And there's some really, really bad actors in that space. But I think basically what's happening right now is we are all working through the news in real time. And of course, some people are more active than others. But if you're on social media, which most of the country is, you are just trying to get to the facts, and you probably don't trust anyone, period. And it might not be because of where they work. It's probably just because everyone is necessarily inundated. There's basically nothing we can do unless we want to force people to have licenses to talk about the news or to gather news. There's almost no way to like put that genie back in the bottle. And I think the best way to handle it is to just be upfront. I still, maybe again, like it's romantic, and maybe we all come from this perspective, but I know maybe 1 out of every 10, maybe 2 out of every 10 people who work in journalism who genuinely don't have many priors. And they tend to be the type of person who's not super ideological, who's interested in journalism for the sake of like, they love history and they like being a part of it. They like talking to people or they like writing, but they genuinely are not like super, they don't care that much what happens at the end of the day. They're just interested. I think that's like maybe 1 in every 10 or 2 of every 10.
Man, I think it's like half a person in every 10. I mean, honestly, I do think and you've said this before, but like, you know, a lack of diversity in newsrooms in terms of diversity of thought does impact, you know, that show that night. Not always. Yeah. I still remember that we really did stress test a lot of story ideas, and we really did see that like we tried to litigate them. We tried to genuinely use like a prosecutorial mindset. But you're absolutely right that there is a groupthink, particularly for really big stories where there are a lot of social and cultural issues involved. I want to go into science for 1 second because you mentioned something in an article once that really struck me because I agree with it as well. So Scientific American endorsed Kamala Harris. And I remember thinking at that time, and I texted with a scientist friend of mine being like, why? Right? Like I just didn't understand what the logic of that was. And I think, you know, a lot of scientists feel like they're in this moment right now where they're like, look, they're just doing the science. And why are people questioning their science? What are they supposed to do in this moment where, you know, they make vaccines or they followed the evidence on the way something happened during COVID and they were just following the data and following the evidence? What is your like genuine response to like a scientist who truly, some of them, I'm not even joking, Emily, it's almost like they've like walked into this door of which now they're in a world that they just don't recognize and they don't know how to operate in this world. How do you respond to someone saying, look, I'm just doing the science. I'm just doing the fucking science. Like, why are you saying that I'm evil pharma, whatever? Like, how do they just operate in this moment?
I mean, I fully understand and feel, I mean, I don't understand it personally, but as best as you can from the outside, I empathize with that because that's like true of many, many people who really are just doing science. But I think from the perspective of an average member of the public who's independent, leans right or is right, they have seen stuff on social media about how Anthony Fauci and Francis Collins affected that Nature article right away, early days of the pandemic. And that is an institution, Nature or Lancet. These are institutions that, of course, are fallible, but have failed in some really high profile ways that people are aware of. And I would say Nick Gillespie, in a lot of different contexts, from reason he talks about epistemological humility. I would say that just showing some serious humility from the heads of these institutions, because I feel particularly bad for like the rank and file at these institutions. As the head of these institutions, you end up in these political situations just because you're working with donors and you're trying to get government grants, and it's just much easier to fall into it in the leadership perspective. But people who are just trying to do research, I would say, I actually think this sucks. Like, it's not an easy situation, but it's also not easy for news consumers who aren't scientists and are total lay people who have seen really high profile example after high profile example that makes them distrust and that makes them feel as though there has been a hubris, not of individual scientists, but of our culture about science in general. And I think you guys probably encounter this more than I do, but just, you know, the conversation now about birth control, I think is really fascinating without even opening the vaccine can of worms. But you hear a lot about this actually on the right now. It used to be something that you heard less about on the right and more about from sort of like crunchy people. And this was true of many things, but just that like, we have had a lot of hubris and people have told us things are good for a long time and they may still be good. You don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater is what I would tell skeptics. But at the same time, we were just so certain and we were told with such certainty that these things didn't have side effects that they turned out to have. And so that's what weighs on the mind of that. And so just trying to put themselves in the shoes and genuinely empathize with people who are skeptics and dabbling in some legitimately crazy stuff right now and doing it without condescension and understanding why people come where they're coming from. That's so hard to do. But when you do it, really do it. I think it's illuminating and actually kind of exciting. And I would hope people in the field could feel that way too.
And do you feel that that's a unique quality of the kind of new media, that you're going to get hit hard for admitting a fault or admitting a mistake along the way of COVID, but that honesty, that humility, it's going to endear you to this audience more? I mean, just decipher that a little bit for this folks, because they feel if I give an inch, it's going to go viral, be taken out of context, and I'm worse off than where I was. I just want to put this behind us and move on and try and get more people vaccinated at this point. Like, explain that to the audience.
I think that's exactly the wrong approach. And I understand fully why people have that instinct, because you're defensive of the industry. And you are trying to bat down crazy people left and right, like legitimate crazy people left and right. And so you definitely do not want to give them any victories, like big or small. So I understand that. The other hand, people look at like big things that were gotten wrong. And in order to repair that, to sort of bridge that gap, they just want you to be honest. They want people to stop acting like they are the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain and have this omniscience, even if you don't mean it to come across as omniscience, whether you're a journalist or a scientist. They want that to stop because Megyn Kelly talks about this a lot. I think Megyn is probably the best person who articulates this because she saw it happen. She, curses on her show now. That may seem like a really small thing. But again, if you are an average news consumer who is not super involved in media or politics, you're not thinking deeply about this stuff on a daily basis because you don't have to you, that's sort of like a signal. Okay, so this person's being a little bit more laid back. They're being a little bit more transparent about their own thought. Like you can sort of hear Megyn thinking through questions, big questions, whereas previously you would have seen a news anchor giving no quarter, giving no inch, and reading off a script and reading right off a prompter, being really crossing the T's, dotting the I's. And what people know is that no longer signals expertise or credibility. And so that could mean
maybe
we
the
air
opposite,
too much
like you're covering up or you're
exactly.
Yeah.
I think that's right. Because, and there's this really interesting video that Project Veritas, of all places, came up with of Amy Robach of ABC talking about an Epstein story that she had. And what's so interesting about that video, super, super viral on the right, probably on the left, it didn't penetrate the media diet. What's so interesting about it is you see her there with the Good Morning America backdrop, and you see her in full hair and makeup. You see her with the earpiece in, and she's just talking about her frustrations with the network, but how she had that story. And it kind of looks like a podcast, right?
It's like she's working through it on air.
Right. And people don't trust that you have to flip a switch now. And even though you're in full hair and makeup, and you've got the earpieces in, you're in front of a backdrop, you now have to pretend you know absolutely nothing about what happened with Jeffrey Epstein, and you have to speak in news anchor voice. And it just doesn't, that signals something different to people now rather than credibility and expertise. Not everyone, but I would say probably approaching over 50% of news consumers.
Well, so let's talk about expertise for a second, because I think you've hit on something really crucial, particularly for the scientific community, which is, what makes them scientists is that they are experts on something, right? That they've gone through the training, they've gone through the rigor of the scientific method, they have to get peer reviewed. There's so many standards, there's so many hurdles they have to go through to then arrive at this conclusion. And, we all use products that are the result of science, and there are life-saving medicines that we take that are the result of science. But now we're in this place where expertise itself is under the microscope and is being devalued. And, I listened to the whole thing, that Joe Rogan podcast with Dave Smith and Doug Murray, which was really fascinating. And all listeners will put it in the show notes, and we'll put some of the stuff that Emily works on in the show notes as well, just so you can, and those Media Matter bubbles, we'll put the bubbles in the show notes. But, you know what was so interesting about that conversation and just the conversation more at large is like, what is the value of expertise in new media? And is it really just as simple as you need to sort of like code switch a little bit to make sure that you're cursing and make sure that you're saying things and you're like questioning things more? Or is there something deeper, Emily, that folks are getting right in new media that folks in science could really learn from and just the establishment in general could really learn from?
Yeah, I think like Megan is a really good example of this, and that may piss people on the left off, but I think it's just because she's learned that authenticity is important, and some people do this in a very calculated way where they are like trying to look authentic, and I feel like all of us can sort of sniff that out. It's not just enough to know that news consumers want you to seem authentic, meaning they want you to seem sort of raw and unedited and unscripted, because that way they can make this is the bottom line. People want to make their judgments themselves now. They don't want to be told top down what the truth is. They know that they have to put a little extra legwork in, whether they're on the left or the right. The center may be the only place where that's different, but they know now that they have to put a little bit more legwork. And for the left, this came after the Iraq War and the Great Recession. The media got those stories wrong, and they got them wrong because they're too insulated with the Pentagon, frankly, and Wall Street. And that's from the left. And from the right, people saw, well, first of all, the Iraq War weighs heavily on a lot of people on the right because they're disproportionately, I would say, affected by casualties and all of that. But also, they've seen all kinds of stories. They were told Donald Trump had no chance of winning the election. They were told that, you know, there was Russia collusion and COVID and Hunter Biden laptop and like all of that stuff. So from both directions, people are just like, I need to be able to make up my own mind. And the best way I'm going to be able to do that, the shortcut, is comparing left, right, center. And I can't do that shortcut. I'm not like, it's not helpful to me if you're still pretending that you think something or that you're neutral on something or that you don't think something. So I think it's just like this genuine authenticity that Joe Rogan absolutely has. Like, you can watch his evolution on some of these issues in real time, and he's honest about it. I changed my mind on this. You hear people saying that. And basically, we live in reality television now. And the reason I say that is kind of a cliche. Like, we've heard people say that since Donald Trump won. It sort of woke everyone up. And even when reality TV first came out. But the reason I say that is because it's still kind of produced, right? Like, you're still putting on a news show. You're still, you know, writing a Substack, meaning you are presenting a thought and you're doing it for publication, for broadcast. But you're trying to do it with as light of a touch as is humanly possible. You know, it's more like, let's say, Bravo than The Bachelor. You're trying to do it with as light of a touch as humanly possible, because you know that's what's most compelling to the audience. It's what the audience thinks is most useful. And some people try to manipulate that production and try to make it look more invisible than it is. And that's, you can usually tell when someone's doing that. But I think, honestly, one thing Megan realizes is that just like genuine authenticity is what you need. I think Sagar Crystal over at Breaking Points are really good about this too. Like, they changed their mind in real time. Like, Sagar talked to Glenn Greenwald on the show, on the air, and had his mind changed. I think it was about Mahmoud Khalil by Glenn. And that is huge for the audience. So I think that's sort of what people are looking for.
Yeah, we used to joke that you'd hire a lighting director to create natural light.
Yes. Yes.
Yowzers.
That's 100% what happened, by the way. That's not even a joke.
Yeah.
Yep.
I just have one last question for you. And it sort of circles back to where we began the conversation, which is, and I loved your phrase of, we kind of live in this permanent reality TV now. But do you think at the end of the day, this new media landscape is creating the mistrust? Or do you think fundamentally it is just revealing the mistrust?
So I think new media, the market for new media was created by the pre-existing mistrust. So it's capitalizing on the mistrust that legacy media did create and should sort of reflect and be introspective about having created. Now, at the same time, I don't think those two things are mutually exclusive anymore. I think it did reveal mistrust, but it does now also create mistrust in ways that are, again, I would say sometimes good, but sometimes bad. There should be much more. I think new media, for example, during the Trump administration created a lot of mistrust among people on the right in, let's say, the FBI. And I think that was based on the predicate for that mistrust was real. And there was some good reporting in new media that went into it. On the other hand, I would say some of the mistrust around vaccines is a good example of where it's more fueling mistrust. I'm not saying that there's like infallibility of vaccine science, but just, some of this goes too far. So I think it's both is how I would put it. And it's just hard to be, I understand why it's hard to be kind of introspective on these things.
That's why we talk to you.
I know. Seriously, you're doing a great job being introspective. It's fascinating. I want to just ask you to leave us with this one thought, which is like, what do you think is ultimately the best way to penetrate and reach people? And like, I want you to sort of collate some of the things we've been saying today. You've often said it's just as simple as just like putting better shit out there. But help us with that, because I think our audience, particularly folks who are in public health, they genuinely, from a good faith place, want to reach people, and they want to reach people who mistrust them. And they're willing to admit fallibility and all of that stuff. But what to you are the practical ways of reaching communities in new media right now?
This is going to, again, rub a lot of folks like that the wrong way because they probably really don't like Brett Weinstein and Heather Heying. But if I look at them, they have reached people. And whether you like them or not, I think the way that they did reach people is they treated consumers just like themselves. They treated them as human beings who are capable of, if things are explained to them clearly, understanding what they're able, you can take this scientific knowledge and expertise, and, as long as you treat people like you're no smarter than them, you may be more knowledgeable than them, but you're not necessarily smarter than them. And you just explain some of this and show your work. I mean, show your work is the big phrase to me. That's what they do. Heather Heying's Substack, she'll sometimes send really interesting takes on different scientific questions, and she shows her work and sort of walks us through how she got from point A to point B. And I think they do that on their show, and maybe people disagree with the conclusions that they come to, but the fact is they reached people and created an audience by treating news consumers with respect, and treating them like none of us is an expert in anything. And so I would, say maybe one way to talk to people in public health is, how do you want to be treated on foreign policy? How do you want to be treated on some really like specific questions, like when the Baltimore Bridge collapsed? How do you want that explained to you from engineers, structural engineers, civil engineers? Like, how do you want them to talk to you? That's how you should talk to people in public health. And there are risks to it. But there are also risks to the way that you're talking to them now, and that you're trying to reach them now, by not sort of being more authentic and by not showing the work so as to prevent bad actors from exploiting it. There are risks to that too. There are risks to both ways. And it's a matter of sort of risk mitigation, cost benefit analysis. And right now, the costs of being honest are wildly outweighed by the benefits of being honest. And so I would say, like, find venues that allow you to show your work. Maybe that's Substacks that let you actually put footnotes in, and go a little longer and doesn't get edited down by the New York Times. They have to do that. They can't put footnotes in every op-ed. But, there are ways to show your work. If you write a New York Times op-ed, maybe write a Substack post or a long thread on X or a multi-story thing on Instagram showing the work. People really respect that. And that can help really grow, I think, people's followings.
Emily Jashinsky, it's been such a pleasure having you on our show. Thank you so much. And, I think it's so important to hear from voices who are deeply kind of situated in this space right now, because I do think that there's just a lack of just conversations happening from folks who are still really trying to figure out how to find themselves in new media and this new space. So I want to thank Emily Jashinsky. We're going to put links to everything, all the jobs that Emily has, like 17 of them, in our show notes. I am Brinda Adhikari. He's Tom Johnson. Maggie and Mark will be back with us next week. Please send us comments and questions to questions@whyshoulditrustyou.net, and we will see you right back here next week.